It's good to see you today. It is February 22nd. Our reading today is from the book of Leviticus as we continue on. In Leviticus chapter 17, we're going to be looking in chapter 17 through chapter 19. That is our reading for today. I think the entirety of chapter 19. Okay, so Leviticus chapter 17, we have the place of sacrifice as it talks about if someone kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp or kills it outside the camp, they need to bring it to the door of the tabernacle to make an offering. So it talks about those sorts of things. Stop offering sacrifices to demons. Don't be like the inhabitants of the land. Laws against eating blood. They were not allowed to eat the blood because it is the life of all flesh. Verse 14. In chapter 18, we have unlawful sexual relations where it goes into great detail. And you can read all about that. All the things as you see, you shall not do that. Because the Lord did not want the land being filled with wickedness. So they were not to do these things. You might notice that fairly strong language, verse 28, lest the land vomit you out also when you defile it, as it vomited out the nations that were before you. Chapter 19, the Lord is holy. Verse 2, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father and keep my Sabbaths. You might think of Ephesians, children, honor your father and mother, for this is the first commandment with promise. Loving your neighbor. We're going to come back to that loving your neighbor verse and keeping the Lord's statutes, of course. But anyway, as we look at these things, and like I said, to come back to chapter 19 at verse 18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. I hope you don't think that loving your neighbor was something that started, loving your neighbor as yourself. I hope you don't think that's something that just started with Jesus. That when Jesus says that, when they come to him and they say, what is the great commandment? And he says, you shall love the Lord thy God with thy heart, soul, mind, body. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He says, on these hang the law and the prophets. It didn't start with Jesus. It had always been that way. The law and the prophets hung on those principles. So here it speaks about, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, I'm the Lord. Okay, now what does that look like? And that's what I wanted to consider today. What does loving your neighbor look like? Well, let's look up at verse 10. And you shall not glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather every grape of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So one way we love our neighbor is when we share. When we're generous with our time, when we're generous with our resources, whatever those resources may be, when we remember those and we help those who need helped. They were commanded. This is what loving your neighbor as yourself is. If you need help, right? These provisions are being made, and it is a part of loving your neighbor as yourself. Don't glean your fields. Leave something for those who need it, for the poor and for the stranger. I'm the Lord your God. But also within the verse 15, you shall do no injustice in judgment. And understand, there's a number of points we can make throughout this passage. I'm just picking just a few. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor honor the person of the mighty. In righteousness you shall judge your neighbor. Well, wait a minute. I thought we weren't supposed to be judgmental. I thought we weren't supposed to judge. Yeah, that's... The verse says what it says. But it says to be fair. It says to be fair. Do no injustice in judgment. Judge with righteous judgment. Don't be partial to the poor, and don't honor the mighty. Be fair. We should be impartial just as the Lord is impartial. We love everyone, but we are not partial. We should not be partial. It is a part of being just and in pursuing justice. Just because someone is poor does not make them right. Just because someone is mighty does not make them wrong. We are not partial. We are not partial. Be fair. Now, verse 17, and move it down a little bit. You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor, and not bear sin because of him. That's a part of loving your neighbor as yourself. If your neighbor is in the wrong, rebuke your neighbor. You can do it tactfully. You can do it lovingly. There's a way to do it, perhaps even gently, but you don't want to bear their sin. And if they're doing something wrong, and if you don't keep them from danger, from eternal danger, then the Lord will bear you accountable. We have to rebuke our neighbor. We have to rebuke our neighbor. This is a part of loving your neighbor as yourself. You don't hate your neighbor, but you rebuke your neighbor so that you don't bear their sin. You might look down at verse 18 now. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the children of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So you do good. You don't take vengeance. You do good for them. When the Lord speaks about this, and he speaks about loving your neighbor, he says, do good for those, thinking of the Sermon on the Mount, that we do good for them, that we bless them, that we pray for them, for those who abuse us, for those who curse us. We don't take vengeance. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. So we do good for them. We don't bear grudges. This is a part of loving your neighbor as yourself. Now you can almost hear the lawyer in the New Testament saying, well, who is my neighbor? Look down at verse 34. The stranger who dwells among you shall be as one born among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you are strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So does that mean even the Samaritan? Yeah, even the Samaritan. Even the strangers. The Jews were commanded to do this. They should have done it. Not saying they did do it. Not all of them anyway. But this is what the Lord wanted them to do. This is a part of loving. This was a part of loving others as themselves. Even the stranger who dwelt among them, because they themselves were also strangers. Loving your neighbor as yourself did not start with Jesus, but of course in Jesus we see the fullness of it. I hope this study's been helpful for you. Appreciate you following along with us. Hope you're having a good day, and I hope you join us for our next study. Thanks for being with us today.